We're going to talk about prioritization a little more generally today. Not just project prioritization, but actually, you've got strategic goals. How do you align your activities with the goals at the corporate level, then at the divisional level, at the team level, right down to the individual level? How do we prioritize and make sure that we're being efficient and effective in executing on the goals of the business? And to help us do that, we've got a couple of crazy guys from the West Coast, Harry and Wes. Harry, I don't quite know where to start with Harry, right? He's been around the block for a while. He was one of the guys who built one of the very first shopping carts, online shopping carts, right? So a real trailblazer. He sent me a bio, and I started reading it, and then I kind of felt just kind of collapsed with exhaustion reading the companies that he's worked with, right? So it's Adobe, DreamWorks, Google, HP, Microsoft, PayPal, Rackspace, SGI, those of you who remember SGI, Skype, Symantec, and all the rest, right? I mean, just unbelievable people that Harry's worked with. And Wes's resume CV is no less impressive. Thomson Reuters and guys like that. And Harry and Wes are both kind of product guys, real product guys, right? And innovation guys. But this conversation actually started because Harry's writing a book all about prioritization. And in there, he was wise enough to realize that there's a methodology called AHP, which again, if you've been on some of our webinars, you know all about it. But Harry was wise enough to know that AHP is a really strong methodology for prioritizing projects, and reached out. And we've been again, those of you who know us know Dan and I did a quick read over the chapter on AHP just to help make sure that it was all kind of shipshape and proper. And we got chatting and said, hey, listen, we should just do this we should do this webinar. So I'm really excited you could all join us. Harry, Wes, I'm going to hand over to you guys to introduce yourselves, and perhaps Wes, you could go first, because I know Harry's going to kick off with a story, so we can then hand on to Harry and he can lead in with the story.
Thank you, Stuart. Good afternoon, evening, morning to everyone who's joined. It's a privilege to be with you, and really looking forward to our engagement today. I'm actually located in Texas, although a lot of my clients have been on the West Coast in my work with Harry. I have a transplanted Texan, and if I were to talk about my career, I would say in 3 phases that I have been a management and technology consultant, gotten to see how a number of the world's leading companies run from the inside out, grew weary of being on the road, and joined a company called Rackspace very early on, and was one of the early product managers for the cloud at Rackspace, and got to see a company grow from a post-Series A small company to one that grew to be, at the time, one of the world's great service companies with revenues over $4 billion. And most recently, I've been involved in both startups and in consulting. And so one of the things that I'm sure we'll get into today is the startup world is rich because the opportunity to make a difference, to act on priorities, and to see those come to fruition, and see those work or not work based upon your own individual contribution, was something that was very, very appealing to me. And so this sense of ownership that we talk about a lot, it really becomes real in the startup world. And so most recently, I was a part of a VC-backed B2C startup. And Harry and I have worked together for over 10 years. I consider him a mentor and a friend. He has taught me a ton about product design and coaching. And so we work together today as executive player coaches who specialize in strategy, and specifically in prioritization. So we look forward to contributing what we know, and I'm sure we'll learn a lot from you as well in the process.
Brilliant.
Thanks, Wes. Go ahead, Stuart.
And I was just saying, thanks, Wes. Harry, over to you.
Yeah. Yeah, so I mentioned on the LinkedIn post, I consider myself more of a student than an expert in prioritization at this point. The deeper and the further I go into the world of prioritization, and specifically the more conversations I have with Stuart, how the more I realize how little I actually know. What I do know started off, roughly 8 years ago, where I thought, I want to write a book on prioritization. That can't take more than a year. Here we are, almost 8 years later. It's finally getting done, and I feel like I've only scratched the surface. So Wes mentioned that that we're functioning as kind of player coaches, and what that means is that in the context of Silicon Valley, primarily at this particular point, it means being a fractional executive and coaching from within that. I mean, I also have individual clients at this point, but by and large, I'm going in as a 10 or 20 or 30% executive, either as a product leader or as a COO, and then coaching from within that point of view. And the gist of the book, in a nutshell, is that the best prioritization somehow, I mean, the best companies somehow figure out how to prioritize, right? And they are composed of teams that somehow figure out how to identify what matters most and focus on those things. And then those teams are composed of individual contributors and frontline managers that somehow manage to, pick out the things that are really going to be difference makers and get those things done. But it's really stunning to me that so few people actually really understand what prioritization is. They understand why it's important. On my bookshelf behind me, I probably have 100 books on the topic that talk about how important it is, and absolutely none of them tell you really how to do it. So the book that I'm in the process of just finishing up right now with Wes's help, with some of Stuart and Dan's help, is really about stepping back from prioritization, turning it into a first-class citizen like decision making, and then recognizing that in order to be effective at it, you have to have a process for it, and that once you understand that there is a repeatable process for prioritizing, that then it becomes a question of, are you doing it for yourself, by yourself? Are you doing it as part of or leading a team? Or are you operating at scale within an organization? And then there's the question of, is it really an episodic kind of one-off or infrequent thing? Or are you doing it periodically, day in and day out as an individual, or in an ongoing fashion, weekly, or, by sprint with a team? Or are you doing it as a function of kind of the work that you're doing organizationally to make sure that you understand how you're ultimately going to be able to allocate resources and keep those resources, and all of that work synchronized and aligned with the work that's going on in the C-suite to make sure that you're headed in the right direction and you've got an effective strategy. So I wanted to just start off with what I think is kind of an ironic and funny story, but it's so typical when I tell people I'm writing a book on prioritization, because everybody says the same thing, which is like, I need to read that. Well, I tell you, people write the books they need to read. And so I'm at the top of the list of people who probably needs to learn a little bit from the work that we're all doing right now. But I got a call from a leader in cloud cost management. It's a SaaS solution that's out there today. Companies making a lot of money helping other companies save money in their cloud deployments. And they called me and they said, we can't get our next round of funding unless we figure out how to get a generative AI feature set built into our next product. What do we do? And I looked into the problem and I thought, okay, well, this is going to take some work, because it's going to, excuse me, it's going to, disrupt their entire product roadmap. And I said, well, why don't we start off with, what are you actually doing in terms of prioritization? Just out of curiosity. And they said, well, we're using rice. And I said, rice, that's interesting. And if you're unfamiliar with rice, and I'll talk about, and Wes and I'll talk about kind of the different approaches and methods that there are to prioritization, and especially bounded in the context of product design and development, because I think having that lens helps us look at the microcosm of prioritization, and then back up to the macrocosm of the grand challenge of what it means and why it's so difficult for companies to do it effectively. And so the guy that's in charge of product says, oh, we're using rice. And I said, well, why are you using rice? And he goes, and he didn't answer. He sent me a video on what rice was. And I looked at it and I thought, okay, rice is basically a set of dimensions or criteria that you can use in a simple weighted, spreadsheet, or if you're less clever, you can put it in a visual framework, and it stands for reach. How are you connecting with, some form of measurable, whether it's customers or whether it's transactions, some kind of metric, and impact, right? And what does impact mean? And the RICE methodology, looks at it as a straightforward scale of, 3 is massive, and 2 is high, and 1 is, less high. And then confidence, okay, 100%, we have complete confidence, right? 80% less confidence, right? 50% or below, like, don't do it. And then those become the numerators over effort, right? RICE, RICE, effort. And effort, the RICE methodology points to as person months, but it is so coarse grained and it is so blunt as an instrument that I couldn't figure out how we were going to refactor their roadmap using something as simple and as common as RICE. And yet, this is a senior level product guy, right? He came out of Cisco. He largely knows what he's doing. And yet, why is he using it? Why are they using RICE? Well, they're using RICE because he's using RICE. And why is he's using RICE? Because it has a clever name. And does he really know about other kinds of prioritization methods? No, he's done what they've done before because that's what they did at his last job. And almost every environment I go in, people are doing what it is they've done before, or what it is that they think is ultimately going to lead them to some kind of better place, without having any kind of clarity that RICE is a function of a set of criteria for a sorting technique. And separately, there are frameworks. And separately, there are marketplace simulations. And separately, there are hybrid techniques like AHP, which are insanely powerful if you apply them appropriately with people that know what they're doing, preferably with tooling that supports it. So every time I talk to somebody about prioritization, I hear another horror story. And except for Stuart, of course, then I just hear about these really interesting challenges, and I'm like, wow, that's interesting. But I wanted to stop there for a minute and pause, because that's the grand challenge in some way. Is everybody feels like they need to read the book on prioritization.
So, and I think part of that, and let's just do a little test actually. While you were talking, I banged together a quick poll. Right. So thank you for those who've put in your biggest prioritization problem. If you haven't, what's stopping you? You need to prioritize that, guys. But in the meantime, here's a little poll. Right. So we're talking about prioritization. And usually, the reason that's top of, the reason you get that reaction is because everybody that I've spoken to, the votes are coming in already. Everyone I've spoken to, right, feels overloaded. Right. And it feels like it's got worse. I'm not sure that it has actually got worse, but it feels like it's got worse because we have better communication. So it's kind of visible, and you keep getting these reminders and tasks and team messages that you got a long to-do list, right? And there we go. There we go. Right. We'll end the poll there and just share the results. Right. So no big surprise here. Nobody says they've got about the right amount of work. Nobody says they're off to the golf course. Everyone feels overloaded, right, on this call to some degree, a bit or a lot. So Wes, when it comes to kind of product and things like that, how do you start to take that apart? How do you start thinking about projects and product direction when you always have too much to do?
So 2 things. First of all, I think it's very critical when it comes to the amount of proposed work to, as best you're able from the position you're in, to connect what you are doing to the greater story of how the company is moving forward in the world in order to achieve its vision. That in many ways becomes a great filter for what you should do next.
Okay, so that's important. I want you to say it again. Say what you said again. but really with feeling this time, because that's a really profound statement, right?
The story matters. We're organizations, but behind that we're individuals, and we all signed up to do something meaningful and great, and to be able to connect to that greater good that our organizations stand for, and be able to filter what it is that we're working on through that lens is very powerful. It's focusing, and it also helps. I found a lot in how often extraneous work gets snuck in on the side, and that's, you don't want to say no to someone, or someone else has a pet project. We get bias in the system, and so when we have something greater than ourselves to be able to appeal to, be it core values, be it a lofty goal or a mission that we're on that's clear and understood by all, then I find that it is a useful tool, not the only, because we still struggle with the desire to cram more work into the hours that we have.
And to tie it back to the story I told you a few minutes ago, the CEO said, where do we start? How do we get this generative AI stuff built into our product? And I said, write the press release you want to release, right? Tell that story and link it to, who it is you are and why it is your customers and clients care about you in the future. From there, we can use that as a guiding template, if you will, to do the product work, to figure out how to get from where we are today to what ultimately allows us to release that new chapter in that story.
So you're talking about tying your activity to the strategy, the goals of the organization, and there's some really good research out there that talks about how looking at the overall performance of organizations, those organizations that have strong alignment, right, massively outperform those that don't. Massively outperform them, right? So there's something like any stats geeks out there, they ran a regression of performance versus degree of alignment, and the R-squared was 0.8, right? Huge correlation. And so this stuff really does work, really does matter. And looking through the comments, right? People know this. We got Ronald talking about trying to allocate things within the organization and cascading down, but that's difficult. We've got Doug talking about OKRs cascading down to allow you to have priorities. At the same time, right, we've got Jonathan on here. Hi, Jonathan. Great to see you, man. We've got Jonathan on here talking about priority number one is always what the CEO says, right? And funny story about that one. Dan dug this up a couple of months ago, stumbled across this one where so Amazon, they spent a couple hundred million developing the Fire Phone. Have you seen it? You seen it? Yeah, you're laughing because you know where it is, right? It's in the bin. Never, right? They spent a huge amount of money, and everyone knew that it was never going to happen. And every time they kind of said, "Well, why are we doing this?" They go, "Because Jeff said," right? And so these problems are real, and everybody here has them. So another quick poll: who here feels like all of the delivery resources around their organization understands the strategy of the business and knows how it applies to them? Right, because Wes, that's kind of what you were talking about, right?
Absolutely.
Right. So who thinks that all their delivery resources really know how the strategy applies to them? I'll just give you a second to vote. It's not that hard a question. There we go. So most people feel like people kind of have an idea. And we got one brave soul who says they're really on it. Congratulations. Let me just end the poll. I'm going to share the results so you can all see that. There we go. And what I can tell you is that what the research tells us actually, and what our experience is that when you go and sit down with the executives in the C-suite, right, and let's say you got 10 people around the table, and you ask them, how would you write down your strategic goals and which ones are most important, right? If you've got 10 executives, you'll have at least 20 opinions around the table. right? So not even the C-suite really knows what the strategy is and how it applies to what they do. So, Harry, what do we do with that?
Well, I'm often accused of recommending too many books, but I will suggest that everybody on the call pick up a copy of Rummelt's The Crux. And if you haven't read it, it is a fantastic book on taking a challenge-based approach to identifying the crux of the matter, the strategic challenge, and then figuring out what your response to that is. But interestingly, the place I learned the most about strategy was probably the most unlikely of places that I worked with respect to strategy, and that was at DreamWorks Animation. I was involved in Shrek and Shrek 2, the production, design, development of those particular movies. I ran the intranet
for a second there. For a second there, I thought you were going to say that you were the model for Shrek, but that would be cruel, wouldn't it?
Better Shrek than the donkey. At any rate, one of the things I learned there was that movie studios have a remarkably well, especially 3D animated, computer-generated productions, because it costs a couple $100 million to produce a movie, and it costs a couple $100 million to market those movies. And it isn't too difficult to get the math wrong and wish you hadn't made the movie, because you can lose an extraordinary amount of money unless you get the movie right. And that involves getting the story right. And getting the story right means really working through whatever it is that people are going to expect when that story is done playing out as an 88-minute pixel perfect digital artifact in somebody's living room. The companies that seem to understand how to get their strategies right seem to understand how to get the story right. And the ones that have the easier job with it, I think, are the ones that are extremely top down, the Apples of the world, where, having a movie production like mentality allows them to work through the collaborative conversations and decision making necessary to get to the point that they know what to say no to. Because at the end of the day, if we had all the resources in the world, we would just do everything, right? But what strategy tells us to do is how to pick and choose what it is we're going to say no to, so that we can say yes to the thing that's even more important. So given all that, I just got lost, and I'm now thinking about the slides that I created that I wanted to share.
No, that's good. So at the top level, again, I want to pull that out, Harry, because sometimes people miss that. Prioritization is not about what you do. It's about what you choose not to do.
That's right.
Right? That's the active decision, because the default is do everything, right? So prioritization is an action that lets you deselect things. It's not really, we always think about choosing which projects we're going to do or which features we're going to add or whatever it may be, but actually it's which ones we're not going to invest in.
Well, I think one of the things that really became clear to me, learning about AHP, talking with you and Dan, it just really crystallized the idea that your priorities aren't your priorities. What I mean to say is that your priorities are your options, preferably in force ranked order, preferably aligned with your strategy. But ultimately, it's the conviction that you bring to understanding what's going on in your organization and in the broader market conditions, if you will, that allow you to choose. Just because something's number one doesn't mean that's where you're ultimately going to place your bet, right? What it does is it sets up conditions where you can have really informed conversations. And that's really the beauty of something like HP, because it provides a methodology for getting people on the same page so that they are ultimately in a far better state to agree on what they agree to and agree on what they don't agree to. The challenge with most other approaches to prioritization is that, when I say tree, I'm thinking sequoia and you're thinking aspen, and not having clarity about what we're actually talking about. John von Neumann, I know, Stuart, you probably appreciate, says, I'm butchering the quote, why talk very specifically about things we know nothing about, right? And a good prioritization effort helps us coalesce our understanding of what we're talking about so that we can get specific about it, ultimately so we can make decisions and move those decisions into resource allocation and ultimately into activities that need to cascade through the organization so that we've got coherent action that's effective so that we can be more efficient in how we go about utilizing our resources to accomplish our strategy.
It's all about alignment, and alignment is about engagement. When people are a part of the process, they are much more willing to follow along with the decisions, even if they disagree with them. Another thing that I think is critical of leadership is to be able to speak to what will not change in terms of the vision of the organization, the highest level objectives, but then to make room for, as Harry said, the priorities are a set of choices, a set of options, possible futures. And these need to be tested. And when we test them, it does two things. One is it saves us a lot of time if we're wrong. And two, it lets our people know that we're not just blindly committed to this path that you may disagree with, but this is the path we want to run first in order to see if the fruit is on the tree there.
That's really interesting. So I'm gonna come in and just not challenge or disagree, but put the emphasis in a slightly different place, right? Because when you're talking about projects or features as priorities, I disagree. I don't think they're the priorities. I think they're just how you meet your goals. And the real decision you're making, right? When people disagree about what project to do, actually, they're not disagreeing about which project to do. What they're really disagreeing about is which goals are the highest priority, right? Because if we agreed on that, then we would all agree on which projects were most important, contributed to those goals. Right?
So I really appreciate you highlighting that, Stuart. And here's why. Ultimately, prioritization is effective when we are talking about the same kinds of items at the same level. So commingling solutions and opportunities, or solutions and problems, they become very difficult to prioritize against. And so at the end of the day, from a product perspective, I love to prioritize opportunities. There's a very well done framework by Teresa Torres, who made this popular, called the opportunity solution tree. And in it, we just see a tree diagram from top to bottom of the organization's top objectives in terms of the type of organization it wants to be and how it intends at a high level to meet those objectives. And then there are opportunities to pursue in pursuit of those goals. And then from that level down, we have a myriad of possible solutions that could deliver, right? And then once we pick that, we're gonna like have experiments even. So ultimately, what we're doing when we do it well, I think, is we're prioritizing at the opportunity level, and we're saying what are the most important, as you said, goals. What are the most important opportunities for us to pursue, goals to pursue, problems to solve, and from there, the solutioning is really just someone's best proposal for how to achieve that may or may not be true.
Yeah, I've been interviewing along that point. I've been interviewing companies that have deployed OKRs with tooling and without. And one of the great challenges, I know somebody asked a question about OKRs, is OKRs. If you boil it down just to the most simple construct, we're talking about objectives, right? And objectives in theory are really components of goals, and goals in theory are essentially a response to a strategy. And the challenge with the way most people are approaching OKRs is they don't understand what their priorities are. So they haven't translated from the strategy to the goals to their priorities. And what they're doing then is they're distributing the responsibility for figuring out what those priorities are without doing the work throughout the organization. And it's very hard to link these things then back to what it is the organization is trying to do, even if the OKRs cascade to some extent. And that's actually, I think, one of the larger challenges that I'm seeing, at least in Silicon Valley at scale, is that the mechanisms to cascade priorities down doesn't exist.
That's a very good point. And OKRs in particular can be quite dangerous, because often what you find is that the OKRs are set before you figure out which projects and initiatives actually have the biggest impact. So what that does is it means that you have a whole bunch of executives who have bonuses tied to delivering on a particular OK or R, right? And so when you're trying to select projects, you suddenly have all this noise, because everyone's fighting for their project because they need that project to hit their objective and get the bonus. And so, you know, in an ideal world, you flip that on its head, right? And your prioritization shouldn't be part of, you know, it's not a budgeting process. It's not it's actually part of your core strategy planning, right? Your core strategic planning. And it should come before you assign the OKRs, because your projects are the things that are, you know, which the projects that you, I mean, in reality, it's kind of iterative, right? You say, well, we'd like to grow by 30%. And then you look at, right, what are those opportunities, Wes, that you were talking about, right? What are those opportunities? Okay, the opportunities we've got can give us 20%. So actually now now we've picked our opportunities, we're going to set the objectives for the organization based off of that, right? And when you do that, then you get rid of a lot, I won't say all, but you get rid of a lot of the politicking, the fighting for my project stuff that goes on, the guys who sneak around the back and try and get the project done on the quiet. You know, you get rid of all of that, because suddenly we've set the objectives so that and we've got the actions that are aligned with strategy and the objectives supporting all of that, right? Consistently.
And absolutely, Stuart. And as I earlier mentioned, alignment is deeply connected to a sense of fairness or integrity within the process. And so this is where a tool like AHP can be very, very valuable. Ultimately, you're looking to determine what matters most in terms of the criteria that exist. And then how much do you weight those criteria relative to one another? And going through the process, Stuart, we're just meeting and talking, but I think you would likely agree that we're not blindly obligated to take the project that scores the highest, but it gives us a quantitative point of view that, based upon what we have all said as an organization, this is what has scored first. And then there's a qualitative view as well from leadership as to what we truly believe that get combined into a decision, a set of decisions and actions that become essentially they become the plans that are then activated upon by the organization. And so I think this sense that, going back to, if you're in the middle of an organization or if you manage individual contributors, this sense that fairness is very important. And so even when your project isn't chosen, even if it's scored highly, you're getting an explanation as to what the thinking is behind the executives who may have chosen a different path. And it also legitimizes your case should the first path chosen not be the correct path.
Yeah, I love that.
Love it.
I want to shift. Go ahead.
Yeah, go ahead, Harry. Go ahead.
I was going to shift the focus of the conversation to just a small number of slides that I put together. But before I do that, was there something you wanted to contribute?
Yeah, so I was just going to ask one question. So Rolando asks, so what level of definition, benefits, risk, budget, schedule, does a project need in order to prioritize within a project portfolio? And that sort of ties to a little bit of what you were just talking about, Wes, right? And that sort of hierarchy, and what level of detail do you think is appropriate?
I would say it's whatever the even level of abstraction is with the things you're comparing it to. It's not an answer you can give in and of itself to a particular item. It's something that has to allow you to have apples to apples or oranges to oranges comparisons across a portfolio of competing items, right?
That's right.
And so every item needs to have one or more, preferably two at least, attributes and values associated with those things. And if you can agree on what those attributes are, and you could think about attributes as criteria, and you can agree on what the metrics are, or at least how you're assigning value to those metrics, and you can, once you have some reasonable degree of agreement or alignment around that, it allows you to say this versus that. Without that level of clarity, it's just an academic exercise, and it doesn't end well.
And I think, yeah, and coming to that, right, one of the great things about AHP is it lets you compare apples with apples, but it doesn't let you compare apples with elephants, right? They're two different. And so what you find is that when you're prioritizing, you actually end up with multiple portfolios. So one of our customers, for example, their engineering team uses this. It's a charity that runs all the lifeboats here in the UK. And they have two portfolios. They've got a portfolio for the small tasks, right? And they've got a portfolio for the big projects, right? So a big project is refitting a rescue boat or something, right? Small project might be making a change to an engineering diagram. And the level of information you need for those two is completely different, right? Something that's going to take 2 hours of work, do you know what? You're not going to spend a lot of time analyzing that. You're just going to answer a couple of questions, get a nice quick score, and then just treat it like an agile backlog, take them off the top. The ones with the highest score, you just go, you don't need to do a lot of thinking, right? Those big projects, you're going to do a lot more analysis. You're going to look at a lot more of what's the benefit, what's the cost, what resources do we need, what resources do we have available. You're going to overlay all of that information, right? So the answer really is, it depends, right? And it depends what kind of portfolio you're working with, and so on and so forth. So it's a great question. Thank you for that. Harry, you want to share? Oh, sorry, go ahead, Wes.
Oh, excuse me, Stuart. The best heuristic I can offer to you is think of items that exist at the same altitude. You wouldn't compare opening a data center with establishing a new flavor of Linux, let's say if you're a cloud provider. These are two different, completely different types of work, of items that you would compare, that you would set in separate categories.
Yeah, with significantly different implications of getting it right and getting it wrong.
Yes.
Yeah. So we may have lost Stuart. Hopefully,
no, still there you are. Sorry, I just saw smoke going past my window outside and just wondered if anything important was on fire.
Speaking of priority.
Yeah, absolutely. So Harry, you had some slides you wanted to share.
Yeah, just a small number of slides. Hopefully you can see what I'm sharing here. So the speaking of dimensions and altitudes, and one of the challenges that we were talking about earlier has to do with how do you select a method. It's not just how you do compare items, but how do you actually select methods. And there are a number of things that are really at play in terms of selecting a method. And one of the things that Wes and I have been talking about is the difference between selecting an approach for value streams, a subset of which you might consider to be products versus projects. And I tend to look at projects, as even large ones, as somewhat time-bounded or temporary work by groups of people that may not work together day in and day out for forever, right? And so it depends a lot in selecting a method what you're optimizing for. Are you optimizing for something that's going to continue forever, or are you optimizing for something that is going to have some kind of scope or time bound associated with it? We talked about the strategic versus tactical level. There's also a question of life cycle stage and complexity, like where is this thing in its ongoing evolution, and what level of complexity, whether it's cognitive complexity of the people required to be working on it, or whether it's the intrinsic dynamic or static complexity of the thing itself, is going to affect how you might want to be looking at the different methods. Organizational scope teams have, obviously, this is a huge issue when it comes to picking your methods. If you're working in a large, tens of thousands of people across multiple sites and countries and different languages and different time zones, it's going to require that you approach things a little bit differently. And then there are going to be certain things that are going to work well in some cultures and structures, and versus things that work in others. So I wanted to use this just as a lens for looking at, the first part of the book talks about, a repeatable process, which is really, decide, is it worth the investment to prioritize? And, obviously when you get down to the small thing, you can run a quick process, make a decision, move on. A very large thing, the implications of, not being intentional about your process can have long-term cascading implications. Engaging in the process, right? Figuring out who the stakeholders are and identifying, the information sources, gathering the information that's required, arranging that information into whatever form is going to be most useful, normalizing it in whatever way is required, picking the criteria, sorting through all of that. And ultimately, the focus, when most people think about prioritization, they think about the P, but all this other stuff has to happen beforehand. And, I'm not going to continue, talking about how awesome AHP is, because I personally have never been through a complex AHP deployment. However, from everything I know about AHP, part of what's so excellent and valuable in the process is it really does force you to go through this repeatable process. And so the book walks you through each of these phases and then looks at what it means to do it as an individual, to do it as a team, or to do it as an organization. The challenge...
Actually, Harry, just before you leave that slide, so I just want to throw in here something that, again, making explicit something that you said there, which is a lot of people think of prioritization as a meeting, right? We have the prioritization meeting, and that's where it happens. But that's not where it happens. Prioritization is a process, right? It starts, and this is a good model for thinking about it, right? You decide to prioritize, you engage with people, you figure out what's important, you gather all the information, the alternatives, you score them, you arrange them, then you're ready to prioritize. Oh, and by the way, then you're going into execution, right? So then you want to be monitoring and staying on top of that and reprioritizing if things change, right? So it's this continuous process, which I think comes out really nicely here. So thank you for putting that up.
Yeah, and this became clear to me. This became clear to me once again at DreamWorks, where I realized, people talk about animation like it's the thing that you do to make the character move. But animation is actually a remarkably complex process of, getting the story right and getting the actual digital artifact delivered, and everything in between that's required in order to, when Shrek sits down on a chair, that chair doesn't exist. It's software. Somebody had to build it before they started animating. And knowing what the sequence of activities is, and knowing what all of that, knowing what needs to be done, putting all the information together, aligning all the resources, and then setting up for the act of animating the characters themselves is a beautiful analogy, in a sense, to what prioritization is about. The act of prioritization, if you will, is one point in the overall repeatable prioritization process. So the part of the challenge that we talked about earlier was, we talked about the fact that, when you look at prioritization as a point event, people often don't have enough time to do it. Usually the process is driven by, either the highest paid or loudest person in the room. And often the way that it's that people respond to it is they pick the method they know, or they grab something that seems to have a clever name, and they move forward with it without any real understanding of what its limitations are and what the implications of those limitations are going to be. Sure, Stuart can talk for hours about the fact that, generally most prioritization efforts don't spend enough time defining what the criteria are. What are the measuring sticks you're going to use for determining whether something's important or not? And then how do you get people in alignment about what those criteria are? And then Most people move into this stuff without sufficient tooling and with very deep assumptions about whether the approach is going to be is going to work at all. And I often talk about this as the fact the learning loop is broken in prioritization, because people don't realize the failures they're experiencing 2 years down the road. You can often thread that needle all the way back to the decisioning and prioritization process that led to the results that led to those outcomes. But the time scale is so long that people often don't make these particular links. Then in the context of prioritization at large, I mentioned earlier, there are sorting techniques, and I'll outline those in a second, frameworks, simulations, and hybrid methods. This distinction, it seems so simple in retrospective, right? You look back and you're like, of course there are sorting techniques, of course there are frameworks, of course there are simulations. But if you go out on the internet and you start searching for prioritization techniques, they're going to call something that's a sorting technique a framework. No one's going to call AHP a hybrid method, even though it's a brilliant conglomeration of a bunch of very effective pieces, sorting techniques, frameworks, and to some extent simulation that go together to actually make possible something that you couldn't do unless you linked these things together in a repeatable way and then provided purpose-built tooling to allow it to happen. So just as examples, and really I'm thinking about this from the point of view of product design and development, the common sorting techniques, okay, everybody knows what stack ranking is. It should have said stack or force ranking. I'm sorry for the typo there. Pairwise or paired comparison, right? It's fundamental, right? It is one of the core fundamental sorting techniques that almost guarantees that you're going to end up with a force ranking that makes some kind of sense, even if you can't articulate the criteria behind it. And it's part of AHP. It's part of the method itself. And then, we have the laundry list of other kinds of methods that people use without really understanding their limitations. And we talked about RICE earlier. Frameworks. Think about a vision. Think about the difference between a sorting technique and a framework. As a framework is something you can see that's visual and not in a spreadsheet, right? So you have the common, urgency versus importance Eisenhower matrix. Probably the most common framework that I see in product design and development is impact or value over effort. Right. Another thing that's included in AHP. And then there are innovation games from Luke Holman, like Prune the Product Tree or Speedboat or Remember the Future. You can read about those in, I guess he has a book called Innovation Games. And then Dave Gray came out with a book called Game Storming many years later that talks about this stuff. Simulations are an entirely different class of approaches to prioritization. A non-binding vote is a simulation of how people are going to act in an environment. And buy a feature is applying economics to that. And, you can put these together like Legos if you understand what you're doing. So once again, it goes back to what you're optimizing for. And once you understand what you're optimizing for, it's very helpful to then pick and choose the pieces that are going to solve for the challenges that you're facing in dealing with that optimization. And if you're operating at scale in a complex environment with multiple portfolios of risks and projects and products and investment opportunities, maybe less so investment opportunities, but AHP is pretty much the only hybrid method I personally have been able to find that stands up to the scrutiny of, can you run it in an organization with people that know what they're doing with purpose-built tooling to end up with an outcome that's likely to lead to resource allocation that's going to be aligned back to the strategy, right? Other than that, you're going to have to sort of put together a recipe of other sorting techniques or frameworks or simulations and figure out how to end up with some kind of sensible answer to the challenge that you're facing. I don't know if I have any more slides here. Let's see.
And this is really cool actually as well, because it's, what you've got here is a whole bunch of different techniques that are applicable in certain places but not in others, right? So AHP is really great for your top level prioritization, your strategic prioritization, your portfolio within programs, and potentially down to product, and absolutely down to product backlogs. But something like Moscow is much more kind of categorical, where you have one or two key people that matter, right? So if you're trying to do it in a large organization versus a small organization, right, the tooling would be different that you need. The sorting techniques you'd use would be different. The frameworks for visualization might be different. The degree to which you need to simulate, so Harry, you've not heard this, but we're shortly going to be releasing a nice little bit of AI that will simulate thousands of portfolios, hunting for the one that delivers maximum value with whatever resource constraints you have, right? So that's a great example of where you're combining AHP, which is about the scoring, with the simulation, right? So the combination may change across different tasks and different scale of organizations and things like that. And one of the big challenges with a lot of the frameworks here is, in a large organization, they don't scale. Again, RICE is great if you have one decision maker, but if you've got 30 decision makers from different, each one in a different stovepipe with different goals and incentives, then RICE just isn't going to work, because there's no mechanism to get them on the same page, right? So it's not that AHP good, RICE bad, right? It's that they're both good in the right place. And so, those strategic, project portfolios, product portfolios, digital transformation programs, things like that, AHP is fantastic. But in those, perhaps in a smaller organization, in a startup, especially in the early days, some of those other techniques are really powerful as well.
Yeah. And Chris, I noticed Chris Cantu just asked about highly volatile environments where priorities are shifting constantly, and how do you determine what to optimize for? And I think that's going to be situation dependent to a large extent. What I would suggest there is often using either a quantitative or qualitative cost of delay. And if you have as the approach for evaluating what you are then going to have to put off, because what most people do is they simply add to the list and they don't actually decide what they're not going to do or what they're going to delay or defer. And so having a group of people who agree that, going back to the D in decide for DGAP, right? Having people agree that it's worth the cost benefit analysis is in favor of being intentional about prioritization. The question then becomes, how are you going to respond to that? And that response is going to depend on that environment. And in the absence of any more information, I would say cost of delay is your very best friend.
There's an interesting assumption in the question, actually. So Chris, thanks for the question, right? Because we get this kind of question a lot. And what I would suggest is that actually what's changed is what options you're considering, usually, right? Your strategy shouldn't be changing, right? If your strategy is changing every 2 minutes, you have a totally different problem. Your problem isn't prioritization. Your problem is you don't know what your strategy is, right? You got to fix that. So your strategy shouldn't really be changing very quickly, unless something traumatic like COVID happens, right? Then your world changes. But usually strategy moves more slowly than that. It's typically a big, off-site reviews, and it takes a while to build a strategy properly, especially in a larger organization. But new ideas come in all the time, right? So what you really need is that framework wherever you are on this map, right? You need that framework that lets you quickly evaluate, okay, this new idea, this new opportunity, Wes, using your terminology, right? This new opportunity, where does it fit? Where does it rank? Does it rank above or below the ones that we're already doing? What's the risk profile? Do we have the right resources available? Okay, then we decide, do we do it? Do we do it? And then what do we not do or delay or whatever, right, to make space for it? And so we had a customer that they reckon that they now make those decisions, that they respond to those changing ideas 10 times faster than they did before, right? Simply because they have a structure, the strategy, which doesn't change. It sits there as a scoring model, and stuff comes through really quickly, right? Because we know what that strategy is and there's buy-in to it. And again, those other methods on the left-hand side and do the same thing, but in different environments, similar sort of ideas. And then the frameworks in the middle are really interesting. The one I would add to this list that's really important, I think, is the priority matrix. Well, actually, it's the impact effort matrix, right? The priority matrix. And the combination of that, the Eisenhower, and with a little overlay of risk usually, that's the bread and butter. That's going to give you most of the information that you need to really drive a decision.
Yeah, and I would just, I mean, this is a very small subset of the hundreds of sorting techniques, frameworks, simulations. I'm not going to say hybrid methods because I didn't find a lot of them that are out there. This was just the grab bag of stuff I wanted to put into the mix, specifically applicable in the context of product design and development. But I mean, back to the comment that you made, Stuart, a minute ago about the strategy not changing, and referring back to the book that I mentioned earlier, the crux of the challenge the organization is facing is probably not changing. And therefore your strategy, which is a response to that, is probably not changing. And it's the relationship of that challenge to the organizational response to that, which largely should remain stable over some reasonable period of time. It's all of the other stuff that comes in at a lower level that causes so much churn.
Absolutely. And so I'm going to ask one. We're actually more or less out of time, so I'm not going to ask one more question. Harry, is there anything else that you wanted to share on the slides before we?
No, if it were only that easy. I think we're
Excellent. All right. So the key message, I think, is two really clear messages, right? Go buy Harry's book when it comes out in December, and go buy our software, which is available now. But more sensibly, right? I think the key thing here is that, and what I've heard from the guys today is that in order to be a high performance organization, you have to align your activities to your strategy and goals, and you have to do it at different levels in the organization. And there are a number of tools that you need to bring to the table to do that. Obviously, we've got a dog in the race, right? So I'm going to say AHP, the way we do it, is good because we've actually bundled a whole bunch of those simulation tools and frameworks and things like that around AHP to make it more useful. But there's a whole bunch of frameworks to help you do that. And I think the key message, if the word that's just burning in my mind following this, is intentional. Be intentional in aligning with strategy. Be intentional in deciding what process you're going to do that, to achieve that alignment. And so guys, is there anything else that you'd kind of add to that sum up?
And not for me. I just so appreciate the opportunity to be here. Thank you so much, Stuart. I've learned a lot from you and look forward to continue learning from you.
Likewise, that's a process that goes both ways.
Stuart, I think that's a great way to wrap it up with what you just said.
Excellent. Super. Thanks, Wes. Thanks, Harry. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. And if anybody has questions or they want to reach out to you guys, how should they do that?
LinkedIn's probably the best way to reach me. I'm Harry Max everywhere, but LinkedIn, Harry Max, Twitter, Harry Max, Gmail, Harry Max everywhere.
Yes, and for me, LinkedIn, W Bright.
Excellent. W Bright in Texas.